HanselMinutes.com. It's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman, hosted by Carl Franklin. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 87, recorded live Thursday, November 2nd, 2007. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. Support is also provided by .NET Developers Journal, the world's leading .NET developer magazine. Online at www.sys-con.com. In this episode, Scott talks about using Google Earth, Virtual Earth, and SketchUp to visualize a new home.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. This was going to include Carl Franklin, but it turns out that the day I was taping this, there were some lanes closed down on the highway near Carl's house, and it looks like there was a pretty bad accident, and he's unable to get to the studio. So it's going to be me by myself. Hopefully I won't bore you too much without my partner in crime. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the work that we were doing on a house that we built, and how we used Google Earth and Virtual Earth and SketchUp to model that house. Basically, we built a house. We work with a builder. We work with an architect, and we started with a basic plan and then kind of modified that plan and worked within that plan. Whether it be moving walls or turning the house a certain way, facing a certain direction, changing porches, changing rooms, adding walls, things like that. And this was in an area of Oregon where we live, where there really wasn't anything. I mean, it was a big, giant, empty field out in the middle of nowhere next to a big hill. So for me, it was a little difficult to visualize a lot of this stuff. So there were a couple of steps to this process, and what I want to talk about is how we use technology to help us understand these things. So the neighborhood, I found that plot, this area that we were going to be in Google Earth. I used the Google Earth download application, the downloaded application. That's the full kind of DirectX 3D version that a lot of you have seen. You can also do this in Virtual Earth, and I'll talk about a little bit some of the difference between the two. In this particular instance, the imagery that I was using was quite a few years old. So not only was I seeing the big empty lot, but a lot of the houses that were built around the area were not there, because we were looking at a satellite image that was at least 18 months old, if not a little older. So I found this in Google Earth, and I put down a push pin to basically keep track of where I was going to help me visualize my lot. And I went and talked to the builder, and they gave us a PDF file that was basically a plan of the neighborhood. This is what the neighborhood's going to look like in 3-4 years when they've sold all the lots. And it gave us an idea of where the roads were going to go, where the lot was going to be, about the size of the lot, and the general facing of the house, and what the options were about where we were going to be able to put that house. So I brought this PDF down, and depending on whether you're using Adobe Acrobat or Foxit, you can copy that PDF as a bitmap, or you can do what I did, which is just take a screenshot. So I took a screenshot of this flyer, and it included the logo and information that I didn't want, because it was a printed out flyer that had a layout of that. Ideally, I would have got the source vectors, but this whole operation is very quick and dirty. Then I brought that into my favorite Paint program, which is definitely Paint.net. And if you haven't used Paint.net, you need to. It's at www.getpaint.net, and it's a great application of a Windows Forms app written entirely in .net. Microsoft eventually hired the guy. It's amazing application. The only thing that it doesn't do that I could have used is this concept of a free transform, and I'll talk about that in a second. That's the one thing I would need Photoshop for. But I found a couple of ways to get around that. So I did the screenshot of the layout of the neighborhood, and I pasted it into Paint.net. And now I pasted it on a layer of its own, keeping a transparency below it. So the background was transparent, but I pasted this big map on the screen. And then I started deleting things. I started using the selection tool to delete portions of this I didn't want. And because it was on a separate layer and there was transparency behind it, which is represented in most Paint programs, including Paint.net, as a checkerboard pattern, So when you see the checkerboard, you know that things are transparent. I would just keep deleting. I ended up using an eraser. I used the Magic Wand selection tool. I used anything that I could to basically punch out this neighborhood layout. So I had a transparent layout. And then you want to save that as a PNG, because PNGs have that extra alpha layer. You've got RGB plus alpha. And the alpha is a transparency layer that also gives you 255 levels of transparency. So just like RGB give you 0 to 255 values of red, green, and blue, adding that alpha layer, which is available in PNG and a couple other formats, but certainly not in JPEG. That's going to make it so when we import our map, it's going to look nice. So then we go into Google Earth, into the Google Earth desktop application, and I say add image overlay, which is inside of the Google Earth application. We're pulling this off the menu. We say add image overlay, and then we select that PNG. Now you know you did it right if you can't see any of the edges of the white, none of the logos or anything like that came in from whatever you're trying to import. Now in this case, I'm importing a picture of a neighborhood. This could be another texture, or it could be a picture that you've drawn or whatever. It could be a logo. It doesn't necessarily have to be a map like I've done. Now, when you've got this overlaid image sitting in Google Earth, oftentimes it will come in at the wrong size. It'll come in about the size you see it on the screen. So you can mitigate that by zooming in really far into Google Earth and trying to get a one-to-one relationship by orienting Google Earth in the same way. But I found that to be really difficult. Instead, you can look in the Places pane, which is usually on the left side of the Google Earth screen, and you can find that overlay because it'll appear as a place. Anything that you put into Google Earth, whether it be a model or an image, will show up in your tree view there. You can then right-click on it and go Properties, and then you can see the transparency values. You can see the altitude. How far up in the air is this thing floating, or is it actually sitting on the Earth itself? So then, by manipulating these values, you can kind of resize your image. It's important to note, though, that you're not actually resizing the image, but rather you are kind of changing Google Earth's perception of it. So this isn't image manipulation in the classic this many pixels by this many pixels perspective. This is about where in the latitude and longitude does this thing fit, and how much space is it going to occupy. If you get it right, then you can close the Properties dialog and you can move Google Earth around in 3 dimensions and see how your lot diagram fits on top of that big empty lot in Google Earth. This is a really valuable technique, I think, for a real estate agent. Now, I'm not a real estate guy, but because I've been playing a lot with these kind of technologies, I have this kind of feeling, and this is a little bit of an egotistical thing, but I have this feeling that if I was a real estate agent, man, I could really tear it up, because I would be the real estate agent that would come with a big-ass laptop, sit down in your living room, model the house, show you different neighborhoods. We do like 3D flyovers. I don't know that would impress me if I was buying a house. I don't know if that would necessarily impress the other people. I'm sure there's lots of aspects of real estate that have nothing to do with that, but I sure feel like I would be impressed if I could do that. I had a real estate agent recently on another house that we had as a rental, and he did the entire transaction on a tablet PC. And he wasn't that technical, but he just really liked the idea of not having paper. So we were just signing TIFF files and using the Windows Fax and Scan. He come up with a whole workflow based entirely on TIFF files. And it was just a very cool experience. And then at the end, he gave me an encrypted CD-ROM with my documents on it. More and more, we're seeing that. Actually, when we finished closing on this house, which was through a larger company, we received a CD-ROM with those files encrypted on it, which I thought was pretty slick. Now, in this instance, I'm using Google Earth to overlay this imagery, and I'm seeing a pretty old satellite image. So I went over to Microsoft Virtual Earth. You can get to that from virtualearth.com or maps.live.com. They've got those helicopter flyovers. So then I could actually look at a helicopter flyover of the area, or airplane or drone, some kind of ninja airplane that flew over and took pictures of the area from a much, much lower altitude. And these are done kind of in an isometric view. They're a specific angle. So they're very regular, these images. So then you can use in Paint.net the rotate zoom tool. It's not the free transform. What the free transform lets you do, and the free transform is something that people are begging for paint.net to have. Maybe they'll listen to this podcast and it'll help us out. But basically, it allows you to grab the handles of something that you've selected. So you can draw a square, rubber band it, and then grab a handle. And then as you move it, basically transform it to fit into a three-dimensional space. You can skew it any way that you want. You can do similar stuff with the rotate zoom. The rotate zoom tool basically gives you a picture of a three-dimensional ball that you can then turn and then change the perspective that we are looking at that particular image. It's a little unrefined, but it allowed me to do this this virtual Earth where I basically turned it 30 degrees and viewed my layout, my lot layout, in a much better piece of imagery. So the point that I'm trying to make is that I guess I'm disappointed that it's so difficult for someone like my mom or a non-technical kind of archetypal person to take something like a PDF, extract an image out of it, and get that into an application like Google Earth. I mean, Google Earth goes out of its way to make this available to you. But even the basic concept of like layers in something like Paintbrush doesn't exist. So you have to go and put paint.net on the machine. So the barrier to entry just for basic image manipulation is too much, because even layers aren't available to the average Joe unless they go looking for an image manipulation program. But then also the idea of taking a screenshot, cropping it, punching out transparency. The barrier to entry is really great. Seems very intuitive to the alpha geek, to the person who gets this, but I'm still haven't quite figured out how I'm going to explain this to someone other than teaching them by rote and saying, well, just do this step by step. Here's how it works. When I think that it's the why that makes it so interesting. Why does this work? Why is this possible? So then the next step, which happened a little bit later when we actually picked our layout, and then we needed to do some kind of architectural changes. And we had the architect draw up what we wanted the house to look like. And then I taught the real estate agent how to use this Google SketchUp program. It's a fantastic application. It's completely turned 3D modeling on its head. I did some 3D modeling about 10 years ago, and it was tedious at best. It was very, very difficult. I found it to be very frustrating. I did some AutoCAD as well, and I found AutoCAD and doing machining to be a lot more intuitive than some of the 3D modeling applications that are out there. SketchUp has a different perspective on doing things because it has this inference engine. It has this notion of inferring what the user might want to do, because it's going to use the view that you have of a three-dimensional object, whether it be a top view or a side view or coming in from an isometric perspective. And it infers what you are trying to do, whether you've put your pencil on an intersection of a line, whether you've put your pencil on the face of a particular object or on its edge. And it's basically guessing correctly. It's inferring that, well, he or she clearly means to do this because they have put the mouse here and the view is in that way. So basically using the way that we think about three dimensions, to our benefits. So I worked with my real estate agent, who is kind of not a geek, but he definitely has the geek potential, and showed him how to use SketchUp and explained how we can take our architectural documents, our architectural diagram, which is done in a classic style, and then scan it, take that architectural diagram, and just as we talked earlier where I put a lot diagram and took that piece of texture and then overlaid it in Google Earth, we can then take that plan, that architectural plan, and then lay it out on a layer inside of SketchUp. So we're basically going to trace the bottom floor of the house. SketchUp lets you draw lines, and then in the lower right corner in the status bar, it shows you the number of inches and feet that line is. And of course, you can change that to different measurement units. And then you can type in the number from the architectural diagram, so that you can say, I want this wall to be exactly 25 feet, 3 inches, because that's what the diagram is. And then as you connect those lines, it will then infer that, he's drawn a complete closed shape that is now a two-dimensional plane. Once it's created that plane, that object has some solidity. Suddenly a bunch of lines becomes a face. And then that's where the power of SketchUp really gets going, because then you can take that face and then grab it and pull on it and extrude a two-dimensional object into three-dimensional space. So it's literally a progression from one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional. You take a point, turn it into a line into a two-dimensional face, and then extrude into something more. So then if I had like a draw a square, pull on the face, I get a cube. Maybe I would draw a small rectangle to indicate a door, select it, and then hit delete, and suddenly I've got a hole in my model. It's that easy. So we drew the house. We actually did the first floor, second floor, and the roof separately, and then stacked them onto each other. That felt easier to us. I know that there's lots of people who know a lot more about SketchUp and a lot smarter about SketchUp than we are. But that really seemed intuitive to us because it let us each deal with the floors separately, do the texturing and whatnot, which we'll talk about in a second, within that. Now, there are some advanced features in SketchUp that we had a little trouble with, but you can do animations, you can do, flyovers and walkthroughs, and, spin, look at the front elevation, the side elevation. I know that there's a SketchUp Pro program that real structural engineers who know what they're doing can use. It has a lot more features, but SketchUp Free is just a community supported thing that you can download. You can use for, not just modeling something like a house, but you could model any do-it-yourself project that you're working on, or even an addition to your house, laying out your backyard. It's really flexible. Now, building the wireframe was fairly straightforward, and we had this kind of big white empty house. But then SketchUp has this notion of materials, and they've got a whole materials library. You can also go online and download additional bonus materials, and those materials are things like cedar shakes, textures, concrete, roofing, all the kinds of textures that you see in life. And we also took a few pictures of specific things like cedar shakes and certain textures of wood, and made sure that they were repeating. And then you just select the texture and paint it with a standard fill tool. And then once we started to paint this house, it really became something real. It went from just being a wireframe to being very solid. And then SketchUp includes a little man who sits in the corner there, and he's the 6 foot tall reference point. So once we modeled that, we went back over to Google Earth. Remember earlier in Google Earth, we put the layout of the lot. We overlaid that inside of Google Earth on the actual location of the lot. And then there is the feature in SketchUp where there's a relationship between the two programs. Basically, Google Earth and SketchUp talk to each other. So you find the spot in Google Earth where you're going to do this work. You're going to put your model in there. And this is kind of counterintuitive to me, because what I thought I was supposed to do was go into SketchUp and then say File, Export, then go into Google Earth and say File, Import. And while that worked, I had a heck of a time positioning my house. I think I ended up throwing it down somewhere in the middle of Kansas, which is not where I live. Instead, SketchUp has these toolbar buttons for Get Current Image from Google Earth and Place Image, which is really very clever. You go in Google Earth, you find the spot where your house should be. Then you say, Get Image from Google Earth. Basically, get the current location, get the current view. Then they talk to each other, cross-process. And then inside of your SketchUp model temporarily comes a black and white texture that represents Google Earth's position. It appears on the floor of your diagram. Then within SketchUp, you place your house using the tools in SketchUp that you're familiar with. Then you say, Place Object, view your model in Google Earth, and then it automatically kind of automates Google Earth and SketchUp, exporting the documents as an appropriate model, importing it into Google Earth, and placing it with terms of orientation as well as altitude. A couple of times my house ended up being a few feet underground because one of the things that we didn't build in our house was an actual basement. We didn't put in any kind of a foundation. The house itself doesn't have a basement, but every house has a foundation. So if I were to do this again differently, I would probably add about a 3 to 4 foot big old chunk of concrete block that this thing would sit on, because right now my house in the virtual world is about 6 inches underground. So then in Google Earth, we positioned that, turned it a certain way, and then went to the actual house, which is now last week was built, and I took a picture standing in front of the house. Went back over to Google Earth, turned it around, kind of moved the camera in an appropriate way to get as close as I could to that same position, just to prove that the model that we had done earlier looked, in fact, like the real house, and it did. A couple of things looked a little different as far as the number of columns and stuff, and we'll have a link up on the Hansel Minutes site for you to see the differences between these two things. But it didn't take a lot of effort. I mean, a couple of days' work early on in the process really helped my wife and I visualize. It helped us pick colors for the rooms because we could see what those colors, would kind of look like. Interestingly enough, when you're sitting in one room and you glance over and you look through the door and you see the color on the wall in the other room, that kind of has an effect. But that's a fairly subtle aesthetic that you wouldn't notice unless you actually painted the house ahead of time. With Google Earth and this SketchUp program, you can actually walk through the house like Quake style. You can switch it into walk mode. You can move around from place to place and then turn around and see through the door into the other room and maybe see the colors that you put there, so you can see if a color in one room clashes with a color in another. So a little bit of effort invested up front, being able to walk through the house in a virtual sense, allowed us to make decisions that we needed that were permanent decisions about where rooms were laid out, so that when the 9-month process, the much longer process of actually building the house happened, we felt confident in those decisions. And it didn't take much of an investment. I mean, I'm not a 3D modeler by any means. My real estate agent is just, a guy who was having a lot of fun modeling in 3D. But that interaction between Google Earth, between Paint.net, between Acrobat, between SketchUp, I felt really worked very, very well. Once we understood some of the basic concepts about transparency, about what's transparent, what's not, about orientation, getting our heads around 3D, it was a really useful thing, and I really encourage people to take a look at all of those applications. Google Earth, Paint.net, Google SketchUp. I'll put links to all of this on the Hansel Minutes site, and you can certainly go up on my site and search for SketchUp at hanselman.com and check that out. Well, that's been my lone wolf edition of Hansel Minutes without Carl this week, just talking to myself into this big microphone for your pleasure. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I'm not much of an expert when it comes to Google Earth and SketchUp, but I did have a lot of fun, and I encourage you to check it out, and I hope you have fun as well. We'll see you next week on Hansel Minutes.